Hello and welcome to my Washington State project. Today we'll be looking at Washington's fishing industry. This is by Josh Scott in Mrs. Santos' class, Social Studies, Period 1, 2015. The early days. The Columbia River, the largest freshwater supplier of fish in Washington, was discovered by Robert Gray in 1792. Just over 30 years after the Columbian River was discovered, the Hudson Bay Company began to imagine the possibility of commercial trade of fish in Washington. The very first salmon providers of the English were the Native Americans in 1850. The Native Americans who lived in the Northwest would fish with spears, hoop nets, and dip nets on long poles. The different types of salmon that were caught in Washington were Chinook, king, sockeye, red, coho, silver, chum, dog, and pink, humpback. Between 1850 and 1900, the Native American population along the Columbia declined by 95% due to disease, death by other humans, and displacement, forcing the English to get their own food, as their population increased by 1,000%. Although there were few Native Americans, they were able to keep some of their traditional fishing sites like Seelow Falls. After being caught, all the fish had to be processed before consumed. The different ways a fish would be prepared were fresh, salted, dried, and smoked, before the spread of canning technology in the mid-1800s. In 1886, all of this fish led to the Hapgood, Hume and Company's Eagle Cliff Cannery, which was the first cannery on the Columbia River. This was made by William and George Hume and their friend Andrew Hapgood. Within its first year, Hapgood, Hume and Company packed 272,000 pounds of salmon. Can labels with brand names such as Crown Prince and Royal are depicting English royalty, which reflected the global reach of most prized species of fish, the Chinook, coho, and sockeye. In the late 1800s, over half of the output of fish caught in the Columbia River was exported to Great Britain and Australia in a year's load, which at the time could have been anywhere from 2.5 million to 4 million fish just to these two countries. All of this had a price though. In the mid-1800s, stocks of salmon diminished quickly in the Columbia River. Soon scientists began a hatchery program in the 1870s. To protect the fish in Washington, the International Fisheries Commission imposed seasons for fishing, catch limits, and required sizes to keep what was caught. In 1870, to gain an edge over the competition, fishermen added more layers of gill nets and began to set up traps, pound nets, and fish wheels. Of all the fishing gear, the most notorious was the fish wheel, killing an estimated 1,065,000,000 pounds of salmon. That's not even including other types of fish like trout. The fish wheel soon spread, and suddenly in 1879 they finally reached the Columbia River. Groundfish, halibut, and salmon were and still are the most important fish species to the fishing industry in Washington. Even with these limitations, by 1881 there were about 30 canneries in Washington. That number soon increased to 55 canneries, and at the time the Pacific salmon industry was the most valuable fishery in the world. By 1889 there were 57 fish wheels operating between Bonnyville and Seelow Falls. That's, if you can do simple math, is one fish wheel per cannery and two that might have been privately owned. Nearly all the fish wheels were owned by canneries. Fish wheels were positioned in the river so their buckets, driven by the currents, would scoop up fish from the water and drop them into a cannery or container. In 1893, a special committee hired by the Oregon legislature released a report on the fish in the Northwest, and in 1887 they reviewed fishing problems in the Columbia River. The report said that the decline in fish population was unhealthy and needed to stop. The 1900s for Washington's fishing industry. By 1900, there were 5 canneries and 76 wheels operating between the Cascades and the Dalles. In 1903, Pacific Fisherman magazine reported a declining trend in the abundance of spring, chinook, or king salmon. The annual catch of halibut reached 66 million pounds in 1915. This was the last straw for the International Fisheries Commission, and in 1935, fish wheels, stationary nets, and sea lines were banned. After the first fish wheel was built, they continued to catch fish in the Columbia for 55 years. Companies were frustrated with all the new bans, so they conducted a report that claimed that all the gear that was banned barely had an effect on the fish population. But of course this did not work. Since 1950, the only allowable gear for commercial fishing is drift nets. Many fishermen moved to the Northwest in search of resources that had depleted in California and the Atlantic coast. Fishing was so important to many Americans that they began to fish in Native American territories, which led to conflict. In fact, the new huge numbers of the fishermen hit the other fishermen of the Northwest so hard they got desperate enough to force the natives to lead fish-ins in the 1960s and 70s. This debate made its way to the Supreme Court, and the final ruling was given that 50% of the annual catch goes to the Native Americans, and for the rest to go to the fisheries and the companies. All in all, in 1974, the natives won the battle for their fishing rights. The Native Americans were happy with the result of the Bolt decision because with more fish they could keep what they needed and sell their surpluses. This case is known as the Bolt decision after George Hugo Bolt, the main judge. All of the 20th century wasn't justified, though, for the fishing industry in Washington. After the Grand Coulee Dam was finished being built, it eliminated over 100 miles of salmon habitat. Washington's fishing industry in the 21st century. Today, the fishing industry has around 148,000 workers in Washington alone. The Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act is a federal legislation providing protection and management for non-game and wildlife. This act mandates states to make conservation plans that determine the size of animal population and the condition of their environments. Also, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife is funded by the state legislature every 2 years to manage our state fisheries. Later, commercial fisheries conducted in 6 zones in Washington: the Strait of Juan de Fuca, Hood Canal, the San Juan Islands, the North Puget Sound, the Central Puget Sound, and the South Puget Sound. These sectors have generated $30 billion in total since they have started. In 2006, non-tribal commercial fish from Washington fisheries totaled nearly 109.4 million pounds of fish, generated $65.1 million in value. But not all of the money has come from the fish themselves. Recreational anglers in Washington state have spent an estimated $904.8 million in 2006 on fishing-related trips and gear. Some of that $904.8 million came from fishing licenses, which about 13,500 are sold each year. The Department of Fishing and Wildlife, DFW, received nearly $376 million in federal, state, and local funding. $71 million came from the $904.8 million spent in Washington for simple fishing supplies, or about 19% of the DFW's budget. Overall, fishing in Washington is over $1 billion industry, which helps everyone, from better environmental care of our waterways to the money Washington receives for pulling fish out of the water. So I guess everyone wins. Except for the fish, of course. The fishing industry just became 150 years old, and it shows no signs of slowing down. I'm sure I missed tons of information on this topic, but that's for you to look for, because something has always been fishy ever since I started this project. This has been Josh Scott with his Washington State project for 2015, saying thanks for listening and thanks to the Fish of Washington.